Today's video is another compilation of some of the worst mountaineering tragedies we have covered on this channel, from a winter summit attempt of the Killer Mountain, to the Eiger's most notorious story, or a 21-year-old's tragic ski accident. We cover it all. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. There are very few activities as dangerous as high-altitude skiing. And there is no other place in the world where this sport runs king other than the Mont Blanc Massif. 21-year-old Maxime Manez would test his skill on June 7, 2023 by attempting to ski one of the most dangerous routes in the region, but his friend and partner would soon watch as Maxime would fall over 600 meters to his death. This is his story. The Mont Blanc Massif are located in France and Italy, but also straddles Switzerland at its northeastern end. The highest peak of the Massif stands at 4,808 meters. While not the tallest peaks in the world, it is the sheer scale and length of the range that not only creates an impressive view, but also harsh conditions. The Massif is considered one of the most dangerous and deadly climbs in the world, mainly because thousands attempt the peaks every year, and many of them have little mountaineering experience. On average, there are nearly 100 deaths per year throughout the Mont Blanc Massif, but there is one sport that runs king here: skiing. While there are plenty of backcountry and simpler routes to ski in the Massif, there are some routes that are reserved for the best in the world. Routes that make every other ski trip look like a bunny hill. One of these routes is the Côte des Couleurs on Aiguille Verte. The Aiguille Verte means the green needle in English. The mountain stands at 4,122 meters, but what makes it infamous is the danger of the Côte des Couleurs. It is known as one of the most infamous runs in the world because of its incredibly steep slope. The major risk when skiing a route such as the Côte des Couleurs is, of course, slipping and falling uncontrollably for hundreds if not thousands of feet. But there is also a significant risk of triggering an avalanche. This is because when descending the slope, a skier must control their speed by consistently jumping, then rotating their body and feet in the air 100 degrees. You would constantly repeat this maneuver until the slope is less vertical, at which point you could control your speed using the traditional methods. Most of the snow is loose at this altitude because there simply is nothing to displace the excess powder, so it can be difficult to stop your body when there is a constant layer of snow collapsing under you due to the maneuvers that you must perform to descend the couloir on skis. All of these are reasons why this route is rarely skied. In fact, it has only been successfully completed 3 times, in 2000, 2016, and 2021. But if a 21-year-old was to complete it, well, that would be something to write about. Maxime Manez and Elois Ibete aimed to ski down the Côte des Couleurs in June of 2023. Both Maxime and Ibete are from Saint-Jéhévé, a commune in southeastern France that is famous for its tourism, hiking, and of course skiing. Growing up, Maxime spent most of his time outdoors, as he was an avid skier, alpinist, and trail runner. He even trained judo. He was described as a skilled sportsman from an early age, and someone who always wanted to spend his time outdoors. Over the years, he had progressively tested his skiing ability by taking on more dangerous and intense routes, and by the time he was in his early 20s, he was considered to be one of the strongest young outdoorsmen of the area that showed a lot of promise. On June 1st of 2023, Maxime and Ibete would climb a nearby peak, where Ibete skied down a steep, narrow, exploratory couloir. It was one of Ibete's greatest accomplishments in the sport at this point in his life. But June 7th was supposed to be Maxime's day. Aiguille Verte had already had a dark year, as just a week earlier on June 1st, the same day as Ibete's ski descent on a nearby peak, a 60-year-old guide and his 28-year-old client fell to their deaths on the descent, following a bad anchoring. At the beginning of May, the same year, another skier would fall on his skis during his descent from a nearby route, also dying during his fall. But on June 7th, Maxime and Verte had a positive attitude as the weather was perfect for climbing. The young duo would begin their ascent in the morning, climbing the Côtière Couloir, a broad couloir slicing the north face of the mountain. It was the most practical way to the summit, as the route they would be taking during their descent, the Côtière Couloir, is one of the steepest slopes in the entire Mont Blanc Massif. The duo would climb for hours and eventually reach the summit with no issues. Just like the previous week, they would unstrap their skis, which hung on their backs, and begin to strap their feet in. It wasn't long before Maxime was ready to begin his descent. The initial drop into the couloir is one of the most dangerous areas, as Maxime would have to consistently jump and rotate his body in the air to control his speed. It is the most difficult and physically taxing part of the descent, and if completed correctly, the rest of the route would be smooth sailing. Maxime's nerves were on edge as he began. Every movement was intentional and instinctual, but after a few seconds of consistently inching his way down the slope, something horrible would happen. Maxime would lose control of his skis from the loose snow below him, and there was no stopping his fall. Verte would watch from above as his friend and partner would fall for over 600 meters down the slope, with no ability to slow his fall. Eventually, Maxime would come to a stop, but he was no longer moving. Verte, in utter shock, would eventually radio for help, and the Chamonix High Mountaineering Platoon, or the PGHM, would begin a rescue operation. It did not take long for the helicopter to reach the unmoving body of Maxime, but during these scenarios, every minute is vital. After rescue operations reached Maxime's location, they instantly recognized that they were too late. Maxime had died in the fall, and there was nothing anyone could do to help the 21-year-old. I cannot express the immediate dismay of those attempting to rescue Maxime, and of course his friend Verte. Eventually, Verte would be rescued by the helicopter, and Maxime's body would be airlifted back to the Chamonix Valley. The steep slopes of the Mont Blanc Massif will continue to allure climbers and skiers from around the world, especially those willing to push their limits and test their own resolve. And unfortunately, Maxime Manez's story will become a part of the long history of tragedy that shrouds one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Mountaineering in the 1900s was a fast-paced, dangerous, but ever-changing sport. Men from all over the world would congregate to one location where they would risk their lives through deadly perils just to have their names go down in history as the first ever successful summit of a route or peak. Many outsiders looking in read the newspapers in awe of climbers like Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, while those part of the community were in brutal, year-long battles against snow, ice, and rock that cost many people their lives. Over the years, a few mountains became notorious due to a factor of reasons: size, difficulty, location, weather, you name it. But conquering one of these peaks meant your name would never be forgotten. Toni, Kurz, a German mountain climber in the 1930s, would be chasing the first summit on one of these peaks, the most famous rock wall in the world, the north face of the Eiger. This is his story. The north face of the Eiger is a legendary climb, but also a deadly one. It is the easternmost peak of a ridge crest that extends across the Munch to the Jungfrau, constituting one of the most emblematic sights of the Swiss Alps. The vertical wall of rock and ice rises 6,000 feet above the Swiss Alps and overlooks a beautiful meadow. Located between Grindelwald and Kleinscheidegg in Switzerland, a mountain railway's junction and a pass, which can be reached from both sides. The mountain stands as a tourist attraction and a challenge for climbers brave enough to venture on its walls. The north face is considered to be one of the three greatest faces of the Alps, as well as being known as the biggest sheer face in Europe. In terms of technical difficulty, it surpasses many 8,000-meter peaks in the Himalayas and Karakoram. The most common danger when climbing the north face is rock falls. However, during the summer's warmer temperatures, ice fields melt and become diminished, further increasing the challenges and risks associated with the climb. And of course, like all major mountains, climbers must pay attention to deadly avalanches looking to sweep down anything in their paths. Since 1935, at least 64 climbers have died attempting the North Face, earning it the German nickname Mordwand, or Murderous Wall. Toni Kurz was born on January 13, 1913, in Berchtesgaden, Germany, where he was also raised. Together with his childhood friend Andreas Hinterstoischer, he made numerous first ascents of peaks in the Berchtesgaden Alps, including some of the most difficult climbs of that time. Most notable are their climbs of the southwest wall of the Berchtesgaden Hochtorn, the highest peak of the Untersberg Massif, and the south wall of the Straight Pillar. Toni and Andreas joined the German military in 1934 as professional soldiers. Adolf Hitler had just taken power, and there was a movement in the country for young professionals to join. Although their stint in the military would only last 2 years, in 1936 the duo left Berchtesgaden, where they were serving, and biked over 245 miles to Switzerland, to the location of the Eiger. Toni had dreamed of reaching the summit for multiple years at this point. He was not only interested in reaching the top, he wanted to do it by climbing the most difficult route up the North Face. Toni and Andreas would begin their climb on July 18, 1936. Andreas proved to be an exceptional climber, mastering difficult traverses at the start of their journey. While on the mountain, 2 other Austrian mountaineers, Willi Angerer and Eddie Rainier, were following the same route not far behind. After using a line Andreas had placed, the 4 climbers would agree to team up to better tackle the wall. Local tourists began to notice these 4 men on the wall from below and became mesmerized by their attempt. Most onlookers thought the group was completely mad, while small families would have picnics in the meadow, watching the climbers slowly creep up the wall. Toni and the men made quick progress on their first day, easily scaling the first 400 meters. Upon reaching the first ice field, they slowed down above a section called Red Rock. Here, Andreas performed a deadly traverse to lay down safety lines for the rest of the men. This section would eventually be called the Hinterstoischer Traverse, after Andreas. After all men had passed this section, they removed the safety rope and took it with them, as they did not know what lay ahead. But this would be a fatal mistake. Their next challenge would be a huge ice field that lay ahead of the men. The section was highly unstable, as some of the ice was melting, releasing rocks that flew down the cliff at great speeds. Realizing the danger, the men tried to complete this section of ice, which was about 300 meters, as quickly as possible. They climbed higher and higher when another rockfall started. A stray rock hit Willi directly in the head. He would remain conscious and appeared to be in good condition, so the men pitched a tent on a ledge and rested for the night. Being a little over halfway to the summit, they did not want to descend, so the next morning they continued to climb. Their progress was slow due to Willi being injured, but they still moved steadily up the wall. By the evening, they had made it to the Death Bivouac, where they set up Camp 2. On the third day, Toni and Andreas would set out at dawn together, leaving Willi and Eddie to follow. Although after a few hours had passed, it was clear Willi could not continue. Instead of going for the summit, all 4 men began their descent midday. The rest of the day was spent climbing down the second ice field, but it became more difficult to move as Willi was barely conscious. As they looked down into the valley, the climbers saw that bad weather was on the way, but without much options, they would have to rest for the night. On the morning of the 4th day, the mountain was wrapped in clouds. Water rained from above, turning to ice as it dripped down the north face. The men set out, attempting to descend the first ice field. Remember, they had struggled on this section during their ascent, and that was with good weather. Eventually, they would reach the Cross Passage, or the Hinterstoischer Traverse, but this time, the wall was completely covered in ice, making their return traverse near impossible without an already established rope. Andreas spent over 5 hours trying to lay a new rope, but would eventually fail. To make matters worse, a snowstorm was coming, and the men could feel it in the air. Snow clouds covered the mountain, and this meant that nobody from below could monitor their progress. They were alone. Visibility was near zero. Climbing in these conditions is pure madness, but the men had no choice. Instead of following the same path they took over the traverse, they instead began trying to climb straight down. 900 meters below them was a train station door that had been carved into a rock due to the railways going through the mountain. it was their last hope. Their clothes were completely soaked, and the cold weather was sapping the energy from the men's bones, but they continued to descend. After a few hours, but what seemed like a lifetime, the men were only 90 meters from the door and their salvation. Andreas unclipped himself for the last section as he wanted to safely lay lines for the group when he heard an ominous sound, ice and rock falling directly towards him. Andreas would be swept off the cliff in the avalanche, falling 600 meters to his death. Willie was struck by a falling rock, dying instantly and causing his body to fall. It was caught by the attached line and remained suspended. Eddie, who had been securing the rope, was violently pulled against the rock. A dislodged anchor struck him in the face, breaking his jaw and entangling around his waist. The rope grew tighter and tighter until after a few minutes, Eddie died due to lack of oxygen. Toni was left hanging between the two Austrian climbers. A station master who was positioned at the tunnel door in the mountain saw what had happened and immediately contacted rescue guides. An hour later, a party came through the tunnel and arrived at the door. In order to reach Toni, the rescuers would have to vertically climb 200 meters of overhanging ledges. But due to the weather conditions, the men decided that they could not climb that night and would have to wait for the morning. Toni was left unprotected from the blizzard, dangling for the entire night. The next day, the rescuers would begin climbing up to Toni, and Toni tried to descend as best as possible, but after hours of hanging in freezing temperatures, he just had little energy. In order to do so, he had to cut Willie's body from the rope and then climb upwards to cut Eddie's body off the line as well. To make matters worse, Toni had lost a glove in the night, and his hand was frozen. Nevertheless, he set out to free himself from both climbers' bodies. The process took over 5 hours until eventually he was successful. He continued to lower himself as much as possible until he had no rope left. At the same time, rescuers continued to climb upwards. They were climbing using one long rope, and when it came time to need another one, a rescuer removed his backpack, but the sudden movement caused their spare rope to fall. The team instead tried to put 2 small ropes together to close the distance between them and Toni, but it still was not enough. Instead, Toni pulled up their rope and began using it to descend, but would be stopped due to the large knot in the middle, tying the small ropes together. Toni desperately tried to move past the knot, but no longer had the strength to do so. Instead, he looked the rescuers in the eyes and said, "I can't go on anymore." And shortly after, he died of hypothermia. Toni's story is well known for all who attempt to climb the Eiger. He was a pioneer of his time, a man on a mission, a man against a giant rock wall. But this time, the wall won. On April 30th, 2022, Matthias Rimml was climbing in the wet snow and shivering cold, 18,200 feet high on North America's tallest peak, Denali. It was still early in the year for the North American climbing season, which meant that Matthias was the first registered mountaineer to kick off the season, and the only person currently on the peak. All seemed to be going well, as Matthias had regular check-ins with a friend stationed at base camp, but then a day went by with no contact, followed by more days, and then nothing. This is the story of Matthias Rimml. Mount Denali, located in Alaska, is North America's tallest peak, standing at 20,310 feet or 6,190 meters. It is the centerpiece of the beautiful Denali National Park and Reserve. The mountain is not known for being a technical challenge to climb, nor is it notoriously dangerous compared to other peaks like K2, but due to its remote location, the wind and weather can defeat even the most seasoned veterans. This has led to many deaths and accidents throughout the years, and comprises about 11% of all mountaineering deaths in the United States. However, the real draw of the mountain is not its beauty, but the fact that it is a part of the 7 summits. Many climbers dream of conquering the 7 summits, otherwise known as the highest mountains on each of the 7 traditional continents. Reaching just one of these peaks is an accomplishment, but all 7? Well, now that's a significant goal for any respected mountaineer to chase. Matthias Rimml was born to be a climber. He always had a love for the mountains and nature from a young age. He originally studied to become a carpenter after graduating high school, but after completing his military service, Matthias chased after his real dream. In 2015, he would shift careers and fully dedicate his life to the mountains. Matthias would go on to become a professional mountain guide, a legacy that has been in his family for 4 generations. But he did not stop there. With an appreciation for all outdoor mountaineering activities, Matthias would also become a ski instructor, a rock and ice climbing tutor, and even teaching canyoneering. Although his specialty was long, technical, difficult climb tours, within a given year, Matthias would average about 700,000 meters of altitude in the winter, 200,000 meters of altitude in the summer, and well over 130 overnight stays in mountain huts or bivouacs per year. Mountaineering was his life. His guided services would allow him to travel the globe and create experiences that have only fueled his passion for the mountains even more. At age 35, Matthias decided that he would take on his hardest challenge to date, conquering the 7 summits. This would not be an easy task, nor did he take it lightly. The dangers and risks were completely understood and accepted. It is an aspect that all mountaineers must come to terms with before they venture out into the tall peaks calling their names. Matthias kicked off 2022 by traveling to Tanzania to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, Africa's tallest peak, which stands at 5,895 meters or 19,341 feet. The mountain is considered an easy peak with a mortality rate of only 13 out of 100,000 attempts. However, due to its elevation, one must be acclimatized to the altitude before attempting the climb, or risk factors like high altitude sickness. Matthias knew this and, given his experience, felt up to the challenge of making the journey. He completed the climb quickly and without any issues. By the time he returned back to base camp, the next trip was already being planned in his mind. In April of 2022, only a few months after reaching the summit of Kilimanjaro, Matthias would travel to South Central Alaska to Denali. The tallest North American peaks climbing season mostly occurs during the months of May through the middle of July. This is because the temperatures on Denali can be brutally cold. To give you some perspective, when Matthias arrived at the mountain, the daytime highs were around negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 31 degrees Celsius. Since Matthias had recently climbed other high-altitude peaks, he felt free from the need to acclimatize for Denali. He planned to climb the peak alpine style, which meant traveling fast with little gear. He would carry enough food and supplies to last 10 days on the mountain, although his goal was to reach the summit in only 5. This is an extremely fast timeline, even for an inexperienced climber. The average Denali expedition is around 17 to 21 days for a round trip, with most climbers making the summit on day 12 or 13. Matthias was determined to climb the mountain in April, which meant that he would be the first registered mountaineer of the season on the peak. He also planned to climb alone, but would be in radio contact and perform regular check-ins with his friend Andy Houghton. There would be nobody past the 14,000 meter mark, which is where the park ranger's highest located camp is. In case of an emergency, other climbers would have to first acclimatize to the altitude before even attempting to reach Matthias. On April 27th, Matthias set out from Kahiltna Glacier Base Camp at 7,200 meters. There was not a steep incline when traveling Kahiltna, but as with all glaciers, the main concern is hidden crevasses or deep openings in the snow. Some are so large you can't miss them, while others are small and ever-changing. One must be aware of where they are walking, as cracks can open, causing paths to change. Falling into one with nobody around to help meant certain death in most cases. Matthias was methodical through this section and slowly made progress, but overall managed it without incident. The wind was slightly blowing, which made the cold temperatures that much more unbearable. He had to be careful to not overexpose his skin to the outside air, or he would face the risk of frostbite, which would surely mean the end of a summit bid. Matthias was following the west buttress, which is the most popular route for Denali climbers. He made good progress in his climb and was on schedule for his planned route. Once past the Kahiltna Glacier, he did not face any real challenges until after Camp 2 at 11,200 feet. After this point, the incline starts to change and the climb becomes more taxing on the individual. However, with the climber of Matthias' skill, this section did not prove to be a challenge for him. By April 30th, 3 days since he left base camp, he was well past Camp 4 and had climbed up to Denali Pass at 18,200 meters. Because of his radio check-ins with Andy, we know that Matthias was in good health and spirits at this point. His progress was very fast for a Denali summit, but that did not come without consequences. Matthias was feeling the effects of the weather and had become tired, but was still determined to reach the summit. May 1st came and went with no check-in from Matthias. May 2nd followed, still with no call. Andy was worried, but this certainly did not mean something bad had happened. Matthias was a seasoned climber, had plenty of supplies, and it was trusted that he knew how to handle himself in a dangerous situation. It was not until Wednesday, May 4th, when a call was made to park rangers after Matthias still failed to check in. A helicopter was sent out to perform an aerial search, but due to worsening weather, the flight had to be canceled. Before heading back, they managed to spot his makeshift tent at 14,000 meters, but did not see any signs of him. Clouds would prevent a search the next day, and instead a helicopter would be sent out on Friday morning, May 6th. That morning, Matthias was spotted in the fall zone of a steep traverse on Denali Pass. This section was a notoriously treacherous stretch and is the site of over 13 falls. Matthias showed no signs of life, and given the weather conditions, a rescue effort would not be attempted until after a park ranger was acclimatized to the high altitude. It was determined that Matthias's fall was an accident and proves that even seasoned climbers can succumb to the dangerous perils of mountaineering. Andy would go on to state, he was a lovely person, a wonderful partner, and an excellent mountaineer. Nature showed us how small we are, that's all. You always have to be aware of that we're just a little piece of the puzzle. That's a whole thing. It's very tragic. In February of 2019, two accomplished mountaineers were fighting for their lives on the upper section of Nanga Parbat, the 9th tallest mountain in the world, but there was nobody that could help them. The duo was attempting a winter ascent by traversing one of the mountain's most difficult routes. For one of the climbers, this was his 5th attempt in 7 years. But a peak, nicknamed the Killer Mountain because of its difficulty, would never be easy to summit, especially in the brutal winter. This is their story. In the dead of winter on January 2016, a group of 5 men and 2 women made up of some legendary climbers like Muhammad Ali Sadpara and Italians Mauro and Tamara Lunger would be climbing Nanga Parbat with the hopes of becoming the first mountaineers to complete a winter summit of the Killer Mountain. Harsh weather above 6,000 meters had caused 2 expeditions to merge, but there was constant disagreements and colliding egos. After one of the men became injured in an ugly 80-meter fall, he would blame 2 other climbers on the expedition for using a weak rope, which would eventually lead to 2 men abandoning the attempt. A group of 4 was then formed, and there was 1 man left out due to another disagreement. That man was Denali Nardi. While sitting in base camp after an acclimatization trip, Denali, feeling abandoned, had a decision to make. Either attempt to climb the peak solo or go home. He went home. A few weeks later, on February 26, 2016, 3 of the 4 climbers that stayed would reach the summit of Nanga Parbat in the winter, becoming the first climbers to ever do so, all without supplementary oxygen. One of those men was Ali Sadpara, who we have an entire video about, so feel free to check that out after this story. Nanga Parbat would become the 13th 8,000er to be climbed in the winter, leaving only K2. But even before the 2016 expedition, Denali Nardi was obsessed with summiting the Killer Mountain in the winter. He had attempted the difficult Mummery Spur for the first time in 2013. The footage you are seeing is from that exact expedition. After failing in 2013, he would return in 2014, 2015, and of course, 2016, each time failing for different reasons. After the 2016 expedition, he felt especially bitter as he had put so much into climbing the mountain, and after coming so close, he missed out on history because of a simple disagreement. Because of this, he would not return to the killer mountain until 2019. Each time he had attempted to climb the peak, he had different partners, and his fifth attempt would be no different. In 2019, he elected to climb with a young, hungry climber named Tom Ballard. Tom was the son of one of the UK's most famous mountaineers, Alison Hargreaves. Alison's story and achievements are historic.
What's next?
In a couple of weeks' time, I'm off to Pakistan to try and climb K2, which is the second highest in the world.
Tom, what do you think of your mummy?
She's very nice and she is very clever, so she should do it.
But Tom wanted to make a name for himself and had completed some impressive climbs of his own. This included soloing the 6 major north faces of the Alps in a single winter. The duo would be joined by 2 local Pakistani climbers. Nanga Parbat, the westernmost peak in the Himalayas standing at 8,126 meters, is notorious for its steep slopes, severe weather conditions, and avalanche dangers. It is also an extremely technical mountain, which is why it is considered to be in the top 3 of the most difficult mountains to summit on our planet. It truly has everything from challenging ice falls, high altitude rock croppings, unstable snow, and difficult vertical faces. The Mummery Couloir stretches to 6,700 meters before continuing to the summit and is known to be one of the most difficult routes. The first few weeks of the expedition were pretty boring. Well, to put it simply, the weather conditions were so bad they just couldn't climb. It was extremely difficult for the 4 men to stay motivated, especially since the bad weather had buried all the higher camps under avalanches. This would cause the 2 Pakistanis to eventually leave base camp, but Tom and Denali refused to quit before they even got a real chance. Tom would post to Facebook on February 19th stating, "Base camp life is becoming almost like a holiday where we wait for the elusive weather window. Many new and interesting dry tooling boulder problems, luncheon in the sun, and afternoon skiing. What more could you want?" Finally, on February 22nd, the weather began to improve. For Tom and Denali, it seemed like their prayers were being answered, but in reality, it was a trap. The duo would reach Camp 2 that day, and the following morning they would climb to Camp 3. Because they reached Camp 3 with plenty of daylight and both climbers were in great spirits, they decided to continue the climb. They would eventually establish Camp 4 at 6,000 meters. On February 24th, the duo would continue climbing, but their progress had slowed significantly, mainly in part because the weather, which had been clear for 2 days, had turned for the worst. One day they were climbing with empty skies, and the next, they were trailblazing through shin-deep snow as a storm raged around them. They would spend the entire day climbing, but after only making 300 meters of progress and the daylight quickly fading, they would decide to turn around. At 6,300 meters at 7 p.m., they would radio down to their cook in base camp that they would be retreating to Camp 4 at 6,000 meters. This was the last time that anyone would hear from the duo. 2 days later, the cook and the liaison officer in base camp would raise the alarm. Nobody was on the mountain except Tom and Denali, so if they were still alive, well, they wouldn't be receiving any help anytime soon. Many climbers would come to aid, including the 2 locals who had originally been expected to climb with Tom and Denali, along with Alex Ticken, one of the men who reached the summit of Nanga Parbat in 2016. Ticken's team would scout the entire route on foot, as high up as the severe avalanche risk allowed. They were among the first teams to use drones at high altitudes. Thanks to these, they were able to scout the rest of the spur. Meanwhile, as the weather cleared, authorities began searching the mountain via telescope from base camp, and they would come across an orange and blue vest just above 6,000 meters, almost exactly where the climbers would have been. But the image was just too blurry to discern if it was Tom and Denali. It didn't take long before the drones from Alex's team would reach the area, and within minutes they had their confirmation.
Rescuers have found the bodies of the missing British mountaineer Tom Ballard and his Italian climbing companion Daniele Nardi in Pakistan. Contact was lost with the pair almost 2 weeks ago during an ascent of one of the world's highest mountains, Nanga Parbat, in the Himalayas.
Tom and Daniele's lifeless bodies lay on the steep slope of Nanga Parbat above 6,000 meters. They quickly ruled out an avalanche. As Alex would state, "We could see that the rope above them was tight. I can't tell for sure, but I believe that either they fell or possibly they were too cold and tired during their descent, and they froze when the temperatures dropped at sunset." Alex would also state, Denali was obsessed with Nanga Parbat and he was stubborn. At the same time, he was no newbie or irresponsible. He knew perfectly well what he was doing. I saw his higher camps. They were neat, perfectly equipped, and ready for a well-planned climb. Denali and Tom would become the Killer Mountain's 84th and 85th victims. There truly is nothing more dangerous in mountaineering than climbing an 8,000er in the winter. Sometimes it doesn't matter how prepared or obsessed you are. If you test the mountain enough, simply bad luck or a simple mistake could mean certain death.